The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, I'm fortunate to have one of my best friends on tonight, distinguished educator, political historian, a great Alabamian, Dr. Jim Vickrey, who knows Alabama politics, Alabama history. He was former president of the University of Montevallo. He's been on the show before, and we love to have him on here. People love to see Dr. Vickrey. Jim, good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be here.
He's got a new book he's written. He's written several books. Jim, how many books have you authored now?
This is number 6. It's
6 books.
Fourth one since retirement, and I've got a couple in the works and did one at Montevallo.
Now, tell our viewers about the book a little bit. Let's go.
This is one I just finished, Steve. Not sure which camera we're
you got you. They got you right there.
It's called Awakenings to Racism in Alabama, and it's about my growing up in the Jim Crow South and my experiences dealing with racism, and it all coming to a head when I was a student at Auburn, March 11th, 1965. I had an epiphany during the Selma protests when James Reed, the Boston minister, was clubbed to death down there.
You were at Auburn in '65.
Yeah, now, I was in graduate school then.
Okay, when did you start Auburn?
1960.
Okay, now let me tell the viewers quickly. Tell our viewers who all was there with you at contemporary and student government. You were president of the SGA at Auburn University.
Right.
You grew up here in Montgomery, went to Robert E. Lee High School.
Right.
Were you president of the student government at Robert E. Lee?
Yeah.
And so you were a high school leader and then went on to be a leader at Auburn, president of Auburn University at SGA. Kay Ivey was there with you.
She was there. Kay was a freshman. She was a freshman senator about the year I was SGA president, which was the year Auburn integrated, and which made that a historic and very interesting year, and it added to my interest regarding racism.
George McMillan was president of SGA a year before you or a year after?
A couple of years after.
Okay.
Dr. Phil Hardee was the one who followed me.
Caroline Dobson's daddy. Mm-hmm.
And we've been friends all these years. And Kay and I used to be friends, but she doesn't answer my mail anymore. I wrote her too many critical letters.
Oh, did you?
You know, my view is with your friends, especially, you're candid. And, you know, I would tell you what I thought, and you would tell me what you think, and I don't lose my friendship over that. But I think I bothered her a time or two, and so I haven't heard from her lately.
Back to this, I mean to interrupt, but I want to get that background. So you're Montgomery base, and then Auburn, and you were leader at Auburn and Montgomery, and then Kay was there, but also there was like Dr. Hardy. But you go back to where you first got this concept. It was 42. Auburn was integrated. You were SGA president.
Right.
This has been 1942.
I was born in 42, went to Auburn in 1960. I was in the process of trying to make sense out of the rules of Jim Crow, and which didn't make a lot of sense to me as a boy.
Were you still at Auburn when you thought about this? Were you still SGA president at Auburn?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And got into student government when I was a junior at Auburn, and was in pre-law curriculum, and left Auburn eventually, went to the University of Alabama.
Law school.
And FSU Law School, and finally finished up here at Faulkner Law in Montgomery. But in 1964, Auburn integrated, and I was part of the planning for that, and saw that happen. And just as I saw the bus boycott happen here in Montgomery.
You saw the bus boycott?
Yeah, I was riding the buses in those days.
Sitting in the Rosa Parks. Folks, we filmed this in the Rosa Parks Library building on the 3rd floor, and this young man saw Rosa Parks. You lived through it. You were 12 years old in '54 when the Brown versus Board of Education.
Right. And remember that decision. Remember seeing the advertiser the day after the decision was handed down. I saw the headlines there, and I remember thinking, now, what is this going to mean? And I was at Highland Avenue Elementary School in the 5th grade then. And from that point on, I was really more and more interested in what was happening racially in Montgomery and in Alabama. I rode the bus everywhere in those days. So when the
Did
bus
most people ride the bus? I guess they did, didn't they?
well, many did, and I rode the bus downtown to go to Westerns. Remember, I was here last. We were talking about my book on Westerns, and all the Western cowboy stars I saw at the Strand Theater on Court Square.
You'd ride the bus there on Saturday morning and watch the Westerns?
Right.
Well, and one of the theaters was right here where we're sitting.
Yes, and I taught here in this building, too.
That's right.
When I taught at Troy, and I felt some kinship there with Ms. Parks because of that association. During the bus boycott, many white people didn't ride the bus. My mother wouldn't let me ride it because she was afraid that something might happen.
Well, I can see why
it.
she would think that.
And I kept wanting to ride it. I wanted to see what was happening, and eventually
you were about 12
I did.
years old.
Yes. And anyway, I observed that and watched it. In fact, my last conversation with Ralph Drawn, the president at Auburn, for whom the library is named, was over the Selma protests and that had come out of the bus boycott and all that. And he really got upset with me that I was expressing views supportive of the protesters in Selma. And he just thought his SGA president had really turned into a radical, and which I had
Drawn
not.
was president when you were at Auburn.
Yeah.
He was a long-term famous president.
Right, he was. And I learned something doing the research on this book, which I don't think many people know, which is when he first became president in the late 40s and early 50s, he tried to get the board to integrate Auburn way back then in order to quietly go through that process, and they wouldn't have it. And I didn't know that until
You found in your research that he did.
Right, and from a publication at Auburn. And I was so pleased to see that because by the time we came along and by the time the board came along and Auburn was about to be integrated, they fought it tooth and nail. And I thought that must reflect his true attitudes. And apparently it didn't. And I just wish I had known that while he was living.
Was Drawn an Alabamian?
Pardon me?
Was Drawn an Alabamian?
Yeah, I think so. Gosh, I hadn't thought of that question.
Was Jordan coaching there, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, and he was friends of mine. He was the only state official that came to my inauguration when I was president at Montevallo.
So he came to Montevallo when you were president. You were president about 10 or 12 years, weren't you?
Right, and it meant a lot to me that he did that.
He came from Auburn to be, because y'all made friendships when you were at Auburn?
Yeah.
Through your SGA presidency?
Right.
He was such a gentleman.
Oh, he was great.
What a great
really
image for Auburn to have Suge Jordan. He was a class act.
He really was one
Selma.
of my favorite people. I'm like David Housel. He is the Auburn coach.
So you knew him and Housel well, both.
Right.
And
I think David is the commentator on Auburn football, and Suge was the coach of Auburn football for some of us from that period.
Right.
And couldn't say enough nice things about him.
So he came to your inauguration.
That he came to my inauguration meant a lot. In fact, I kidded him later. I said, you got more applause at my inauguration than I did when it was introduced. And I thought, there aren't many people in the world that I would say, I am so glad that happened that way, but he's one. And I was just thrilled that he was there.
So go back to the 40, we're talking about the 62 era when you're at Auburn, and Harold Franklin was the and Drawn, they had to fight it, but they were.
Right.
What's the gist of what you're trying to say? You saw, and you got a quadrangle there around in the picture of the book.
Right.
Explain that.
This is where most of the major civil rights activity occurred in Alabama and in America in the 1960s.
What town do you encounter there?
Civil Rights Pentagon. This was between between 1955 when Ms. Parks wouldn't get up from her seat until Dr. King went off to Atlanta in 1960. That was when the modern civil rights movement started. It then hit a kind of a slow spot, and it had to start over again after he came out of Montgomery and went to Atlanta and became a pastor at his daddy's church. And then he was active in the civil rights organizations there. And I really enjoyed going back and tracing all that and talking about it in my book. That's one reason the book is so long. I've been kidded by all my friends. It's 750 pages, and it's got 450 annotated bibliographic sources. So it's not just me and my thoughts about all this. It's scholarship, and I've got a score of friends who added their contributions, including my friend David Housel and Dan Holzenbeck, whom you may remember, and a lot of other Auburn people. and then there are people that I learned about. You might remember the show Captain and Tennille.
Oh, yeah.
Tony Tennille,
She was there
or
with
Tony
y'all.
Tennille, was from Montgomery. Her
That's
daddy owned
right.
Tennille Furniture Company.
That's right.
They changed the pronunciation to make it Captain and Tennille instead of Captain and Tennille, which didn't sound right. Had a popular TV show for a while. She had the same experience that I did growing up here, and she wrote a book about it, which I didn't know about until I was doing
Until
research.
you doing research on it.
And I talk about it in the book. She lived over on Fulmer Avenue near Lanier, as I recall. And she had the same experience. She kept seeing how black people were treated, and she kept trying to understand the rules of the game, and none of us could do that. And I was really touched that she had the same experience, and I would love to have talked to her about that. But that's the kind of thing you learn when you start working on a book like this. There are people and things that you don't know about that you run into only because you're involved in an organized search for knowledge.
Yeah.
And
You're going through your area here. What the title of the book, Awakenings to Racism in Alabama, the education of a native son and the lessons he and his peers learned resisting Jim Crow, Dr. Jim Vickrey. And you've got these cities marked out, Auburn, Opelika, then to Birmingham, and then to Tuscaloosa. That's your career. But you got Selma. You never spent time in Selma, did you?
Yeah, a little. I wasn't there to work, but
Montgomery, you obviously
all of those places I was in, and 90% of my life has been spent in that little area.
And you've seen the whole thing evolve.
And I spent several years in Florida, but most of my life has been spent there. I didn't realize that and didn't think about it until I started working on this book. And if I had to do it again, I'd probably change that to a sexagon and include Talladega as well.
But you have, you consider Birmingham and Montevallo one the same. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, not necessarily. Oh, yes. Okay, I get what you're saying. That's why I didn't include it that as a separate place. And it was not a center of racial activity in any event.
You learned a lot writing this book, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. It was really
and
informative.
it dawned on you, I spent my whole life in that paragon right there. That Selma. You know, I say this oftentimes. I'll be on a Birmingham television station. They'll be doing something about it. I said, do y'all realize what a historic setting y'all are sitting here with our capital?
Oh.
How much history you and I have seen at that Capitol and Dexter Avenue.
And
Dr.
now
King's
it's
Church and
represented by our friend Brian Stevens, does a great work over here with AGI. My book is in the EJI bookstore, which you might not necessarily expect it to be there because it's not printed by a national publisher and all that. But Brian put it there, and which I appreciated very much, and has been very supportive of what I'm trying to do. You asked me a question earlier about what's the main point of all this. The conclusion I've reached after doing all this research and thinking about my life is that those of us who were born white in the South in the 40s and the 50s were infected with racism.
We
It's
saw
like
it all.
a disease. You couldn't help it. Your family probably had family members. My father was a racist, for example, had family members, had friends. You grew up with that. As we got older, we began to challenge the assumptions of that system and then actively to oppose it, as I did eventually. And yet, and this is the kicker, and yet you can't shake that initial infection. It's like having had scarlet fever. You can get over it, but your heart may never be the same from that disease. And racism, to me, is like that. And that's why I call myself a recovering racist. I don't think you ever get over it, and you keep fighting it until you die, or you don't.
So, but you know what, Jim? People, I have everybody who talks about this, anybody who grew up in the South in our era, everybody's grandparents and parents were racist. I mean, that's the way it was. It just it was born into you. I mean, that's the way it is.
Yeah, it's just like getting a pandemic disease. I mean, there are things you can't avoid.
But so, your first reaction was the Brown versus Board of Education in the 5th grade. Came in 54.
Well, let me tell you my very first reaction, because that's true what you just said. But before that, in the late 40s, I met my first black friend when I lived down in Lowndes County for a year. His parents patronized my aunt and uncle's store, where I spent a lot of time after school. And I met Blue Jesus, that was his name. My favorite, one of my all-time favorite names. I never knew Blue Jesus' given name. But we became friends, and we played every day after school. And one day, one of my relatives pulled me aside and said, "You're spending too much time with Blue Jesus." And I said, "What? How can I be spending too much time with him? He's the only kid in the neighborhood." And he was, literally.
Now, what county was it down in Bullock?
In Lowndes.
Lowndes,
And it was in Burkeville. Their store was in Burkeville. Right on Highway 80, the Civil Rights Marchers of 1965 came trudging by. If I'd been there then, I would have watched them.
Burkeville right on 80?
Yeah. And in my mind's eye, I've seen all that, you know.
And you lived in there full time for a year?
Yeah.
When you were a little boy?
And went to the second grade at public school down there. But my biggest memory, and the one that affected me the most, was knowing Blue Jesus, because once that process starts, you say, "Well, why can't I play with Blue Jesus? Where does it say I can't?" Then you want to know what the next rule is and why it makes sense. And that's where it started. Eventually, that's what made me pay attention to the Brown v. Board of Education decision in May of '54. And I remember holding up the advertiser and seeing the headline when I was in the 5th grade. Did you talk to your folks about it? I could only talk to my mother. I could not talk with my father. My father would leave the room while we were watching TV if Lena Horne or Ella Fitzgerald came on television. That's the way he was.
He grew up in Montgomery. Your daddy grew up in Montgomery?
Well, eventually. He was born in Pigeon Creek down in Butler County.
Yeah.
Lived in my favorite named Alabama city town for a brief period called Okie Street, which is right down the street from Pigeon Creek. They then moved to Montgomery.
Is that south of Greenville or right below it? Right below Greenville?
It is.
That's where Hank Williams from down there.
Yeah.
Hank Williams from the same neck of the woods.
Yes, he is, from that same area. And in fact, I note that in my book. What I've done in writing my story is I've tried to connect me with as many interesting people as I could. Hank Williams, politicians, educators, movie stars. When I was on the Alabama Film Commission with our friend George McMillan, I got to go to Hollywood a lot as part of that activity. And so met a lot of people, and I had been going to the movies for my entire life.
You love it.
So I started writing about it. And
we talked about it on this show.
Did TV, radio, and print movie reviews while I was at Montevallo, and enjoyed that a lot. And then when I was in Troy, I did a radio show once or twice every week about movies. And it always takes me back to the Strand where we first talked about movies way back when. And the thing that's interesting about that to me is because of EJI, I now know that Court Square in Montgomery was the center of the slave trade in Montgomery, and slaves were sold right on that very spot that I walked across every Saturday to go to the movies.
Was it marked that way then? It wasn't marked that way then, was it? This was a center of slave trade. It is now. There's a marker down there now.
It is now. But when I was growing up, there was no indication that Montgomery was the center of the slave trade.
And you were walking by it every day going to the
movie
theater? Yes,
and when I had to go down to the Charles Theater on Commerce Street, it took me halfway to the river, and that's where they came up. They came off of either the train at the train station or the river boat that came into the landing. They walked up Commerce and were either put in warehouses along the way, as Brian likes to talk about, or they came all the way up to Court Square and were sold. And Montgomery County had more black people in it than white people in those days. None of that was a part of the history of Alabama that I learned growing up. And it's one of the things I've gotten really, really ticked off about is we weren't told about the Tuskegee Airmen. We weren't told about the slave trade in Montgomery. All of that was just taboo and didn't know a thing about it. And I now know about it, and I like to talk about it because it's such a sad part of our history. We can't ignore it. I have friends in Montgomery that won't come down to the EJI museum or the lynching memorial or any of the other things here because they don't want to be reminded of the history they now know is a part of Montgomery. And I think that's really unfortunate.
It was interesting living in Montgomery that era because growing up here, because you went to school here and knew everybody. And Montgomery has really been the center of the civil rights thing. Yeah. That's why it's appropriate all that civil rights stuff's here now.
Well, indeed. And of course, it's the biggest single attractor of tourists now. It is the center of tourism in Montgomery, which is sort of ironic in a way. And every time I come down here, I go the back way. I don't ever go down Madison Avenue, and I never take the interstate. And I go right through E.J.I.'s place. And every time I see all of that, I'm thinking of tromping to the Strand Theater in the steps of slaves from the 1850s and 60s.
I remember the time you were on last time. I love the story. You know who else knows the story of that? Is Stephanie Bell's husband, John. He was the Bell family, had that Bell building right across the street over there.
Right.
He remembers going to the theater like you did, when all these buildings down here were movie theaters and everything. Remember the old Elite restaurant?
Yeah.
As a young
My last time to eat there was with Judge Johnson.
Frank Johnson.
Because of civil rights, he and I became friends.
Y'all were friends.
And I invited him to Montevallo to speak, and caused one of our trustees, who had been appointed by Governor Wallace, to have a conniption fit when he learned what I had done. I had to spend all afternoon traveling with him around Shelby County.
Frank Johnson or the board?
Yeah, I was.
Or the trustee?
I was talking with the trustee about why I did that, and I finally satisfied him that if I made a mistake, it was a mistake of the heart, and that he was an old friend of mine, and he meant a lot to me, and I wanted him to speak and wanted to give him an award when he came, which I did.
So you and Frank Johnson would have lunch together.
And so the last time I ate at the Elite was with him, and it was so interesting to talk with him, and he would be relatively candid when you get him in that kind of setting, and I would ask him about how he approached decision making and things like, he was considered to be a liberal federal judge, the kind that needed a barbed wire enema,
right, like George Wallace,
Governor Wallace. But he didn't consider himself that, and I don't think he was. He considered himself a true conservative. He said, once the Supreme Court decided the Brown decision, it was my job to interpret that decision in other contexts that may come up in cases brought to my court, which I didn't bring them. People bring them to my court. And he said, I consider that being a conservative. It's applying the law as it now is to new situations. It's not radical. It's not liberal. And he never did accept the criticism that he was somehow off there on the left side.
Did all that stuff, all that hatred bother him that people had for him? He probably was in danger.
Well, he was.
In that era, leaving the federal courthouse, had he already made all those rulings by that time? Civil rights
This
movement?
would have been in mid-'70s, late '70s, right in there. He was just then becoming, I was one of the first people in the state to recognize him officially and to give him any kind of award. He had never gotten a doctorate.
Did you do it while you were at the University of Alabama?
Yeah. He had never gotten an honorary doctorate. If I could have gotten that through my board, I would have tried to give him one, but I knew that was not going to work. But once that process started, and he was being recognized all over the country, Harvard, other places had given him doctorates, but nobody here. Once that started, eventually in the 80s, the Alabama Bar Association recognized him at a huge dinner out at the Governor's House Motel, which is no longer with us, kind of a sad story. And he invited me to come out to do the invocation for that event because of our association. And I became famous for a couple of years here in Montgomery among lawyers because it was a hugely attended affair with people from all over the country. I was on the raised platform where everybody, the head table was. And when my turn came, I pushed my chair back to get up to go to the lectern, and it went all the way off the dais, and I went head over heels off of the thing. And everybody thought I'd kill myself, and I had not been hurt, but my pride had been mighty wounded. And I finally got to the lectern, and I gave the invocation for that occasion. But that's my big contribution to the Alabama Bar.
Jim, what about, back to y'all having lunch together and visiting, would the U.S. Marshals keep an eye on him? Was he
Not that I could tell.
You could tell?
We walked down from the courthouse
Would
to the
you
Elite.
meet at the federal courthouse and walk down there with him?
Yeah, and I looked. I was interested in that same question. Where are the people guarding him? And I didn't see anybody. Once we left the courthouse, there was nobody to my knowledge, and there certainly wasn't anybody in the restaurant. And I thought that was interesting
During
too.
the height of that thing, can you imagine? He had a lot of threats, I bet. His
Oh, yeah.
mother's house was bombed, wasn't it? One of
Yes, I was
his mother's
almost
house,
mentioning that.
and
Yes.
her Martin Luther King's house was bombed.
I'll tell you a story he told me about that, which is a little less dramatic. He and his wife used to go to First Baptist Church every Sunday to church. One Sunday, after a few of his controversial rulings, he came to church with his son and Ruth, his wife, sat in their usual pew. As soon as he sat down, everybody on that pew got up and moved away.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Was it during the height of that thing? Or what?
Yes, I said, Judge, you've got to be kidding me. Christian people actually did that in church. Yes, they did. That was the way it was in those days, which is why I admired him so much, because he thought he was just doing what judges should do. Of course, he was virtually the only federal judge in the South who was being conservative that way.
I've heard that he had a lot of threats.
Yes, he did.
And did his mom move in with him, or has she got a separate
I don't know
house?
if she moved from the house where that was nearly bombed or not. I just don't remember that. But
I remember one of his houses was bombed, I think.
Yeah.
I bet he had a lot of threats.
yeah, I'm sure he did.
But he had the old Winston County spine.
Yes, he did.
They were Republicans and Minority Brothers. They was a
from
Democrat.
Winston County.
His
He
dad
was a
probate
tough guy.
judge up there. He was tough. He was a tough old guy.
Well, I learned in the course
Loved
of
to
knowing him.
fish.
You know, yes, he loved to fish, and he was a chain smoker at one time. He smoked these awful cigarettes, even worse than Camels, which is what my father used. And one day he decided that was not a good idea and went cold turkey off of the strongest cigarettes you can buy. And I thought, well, why not? That's exactly what you would think Frank Johnson could do, and he did. And I just admired him in many ways. And
Would you ever go fishing with him?
no,
You're not a big fisherman.
I never
But
was.
I've
When
had-
I went fishing as a boy, we caught brim in South Alabama ponds, and I never did find that very interesting. They were, about the size of my hand, and I lost interest.
You know who loved to fish, Jim, is Dr. Paul Hubbard.
Yeah,
He loved to fish.
yes, he did.
All those old guys that era, they loved fishing. That was their main recreation. And they had to go there once, twice a week. I think Frank Johnson loved fishing like that.
Yes, he did. He would go all the way down to the Gulf sometimes to fish, fish in area lakes sometimes. But
If you know Alabama history, you realize where he came from, being the son of a probate judge and Reconstruction Republican
oh yes,
area. Winston
appointed by
County.
Eisenhower. I learned something about Eisenhower writing this book. He would have appointed more judges like Johnson, and would have appointed a black judge or two if they could have gotten it through the Senate. He was much more ready to implement the Brown decision than he's been given credit
Who
for.
told you about he wanted to appoint black judges?
A biographer from his hometown area who wrote a scholar who wrote a book about his life, and in that is when I first learned that, and also in some other books about the appointment of judges, that his attitude toward federal judges on not crime, that was a different matter, but on integration was very different from what I was taught coming up, which was that, he famously said, the worst fool thing I ever did was appoint Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. Well, he was talking about the criminal justice decisions, not the racial justice decisions.
Okay.
And I didn't know that, and I don't think anybody did.
So it
until
wasn't a
these
racist
books.
thing. It was the
Right.
criminal thing. Warren was
And they
soft
would
on
have done
crime.
much more if they could have. Isn't that
know.
interesting?
Well, Jim, our time's up. I hate to tell you. that.
Always is, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah. Well, this be a big, great historical book, folks. Awakenings to Racism in Alabama by Dr. Jim Vickrey. The Education of a Native Son, Lessons He and His Peers Learn Resisting Jim Crow. He saw it all, y'all. Born right here in Montgomery, Butler County, or right about. So
You can get that at New South EJI or from Amazon.
very good. Amazon's where most people get books now, more times than not. We thank you, viewers, for watching. We thank Dr. Vickrey for being with us. He's a great Alabamian.
Thank you, Steve.
And I'm glad he took a lot of time to write this book, I guarantee you.
5 years.
I know. Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Dr. Vickrey.
This has been Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, a production of Troy University Television. Opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Troy University, its administration, faculty, staff, or students.